Hello, fifth graders. Welcome to Language Arts. For today, you will need The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and maybe paper and pencil. Again, that kind of depends on what you've been doing to work through your homework. But for some of you, I know it's been helpful to be writing down answers as you go. So, first thing that we're going to do today is go through our answers to our homework questions from yesterday. And then we'll get into our objective, get into today's questions, and get into today's reading. So, with that in mind, I need to get the right window open and I'll flip you around. So, question 1 asks, why was Katrina Van Tassel universally famed? You should have selected for her beauty and her vast expectations. Question 2, what are Katrina's vast expectations? Those of you who worked with the video as a part of your homework were given this answer by me. Actually, a lot of these answers you were given by me if you worked along with the video. So those of you who did not do it the video, you had a difficult time with this one, okay? So vast expectations, this is referring to the land and wealth that she would inherit, which again, I talk about in that video from yesterday. How did Ichabod Crane feel about Katrina? Ichabod Crane felt romantically about Katrina, lovingly about Katrina, something about his romantic interest in her. 4, why did Ichabod Crane's mouth water? Ichabod Crane's mouth watered because he looked around the farm and imagined all of the food he could have. He could have. 5, why was Abraham Van Brunt an interference to Ichabod Crane? Should have picked this first option. Abraham Van Brunt was an interference to Ichabod Crane because he wanted to date Katrina. 6, what was Abraham Van Brunt's nickname? Abraham Van Brunt's nickname was Brom Bones. 7, Brom Bones was known for his great knowledge and skill in what? You should have selected horsemanship. 8, the neighbors assumed that Brom Bones was at the bottom of any what? Any prank or brawl. Okay, so a prank or a fight. And then finally, again, at the video, we talked a lot. I hinted very heavily at the answers to this question, or the answer, or what is the central problem of the story? The central problem of the story is that both Ichabod and Brom are wanting to marry Katrina, wanting to be with Katrina, are pursuing Katrina. That is our central problem. It's going to drive the action of the story. So, our objective for today is that we're going to be working on visualizing Ichabod's appearance. Again, we're going to get some description of him, and so we want to try and get an image of that in our minds. So with that in mind, our homework for today. Number 1 asks, how did Brom Bones battle Ichabod Crane for Katrina? In other words, in what way does he battle for her? 2, what did the man on horseback tell Ichabod Crane? Actually, and this question is a good point to talk about in the story that, remember, the story is set hundreds of years ago, and this is a good indication of kind of the history of our country and where things have come in terms of race, okay? So there's going to be a word used to refer to this man on horseback, and it's really not a word that we use anymore. It's not in use for various reasons, and again, really because it kind of others or belittles people of different races. So I'm not going to read that word. It is going to be in the book, and you'll see it. And again, this is just a good reminder of things that have changed and areas of growth for our country, right? Things that we need to work on. So kind of recorded in text and in our history, okay? But what does he tell Ichabod Crane? Another typo. Miss Bury. 3, what is one quote that describes the horse that Ichabod was riding? So again, you're going to set this up using as many words from the question in your answer as possible. One quote that describes the horse that Ichabod was riding is, and then 4, what is one quote that describes how Ichabod looks on the way to the party? One quote that describes how Ichabod looks on the way to the party is, and finally, of what is Ichabod thinking while he rides to the party? Okay? So 5th graders, we're going to get right into, sorry, that pen was right in the way. We're going to get right into our reading today. So you want to open your book to page 26. Follow along. We're going to be talking about questions as we go. We're at the very bottom. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have 1,000 avenues and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but a still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter. For man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown. But he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette, that word again, a flirting person, is indeed a hero. Certain it is this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. So what we learned is that the more that Ichabod is hanging around, the less that Brom is visiting. He kind of backs off a little bit. But that very last part of that paragraph is very telling. It tells us a deadly feud gradually arose between them. So even though he seems outwardly not to be pursuing Katrina anymore, this deadly feud, right? There's a fight that is happening between them. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. So what the narrator is telling us is that Brom, if he had his way, would settle this with single combat. They'd have a fight. Whoever won would get Katrina. If we were in person, this is usually a time when a student would say, doesn't Katrina have any say in the matter? To which I say, what an excellent point. This entire story is really built around the idea that Katrina somehow doesn't really have an opinion or a say in this, and it just kind of, whoever wants her, that's where she has to go. Again, problematic. This is a very problematic way of thinking about women, but an older way of thinking about women. We today would have different feelings about it, but here we go. So, we see that what Brom wants to do is just like have a fist fight, settle it with a duel, be done, okay? But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. In other words, Ichabod is very aware that Brom is much stronger than him, much more athletic than him, so he thinks, no way, I'm no fool. I'm not going to get in a fist fight with a guy who's that much bigger and stronger than me. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. In other words, it's irritating that Ichabod was so insistent on being peaceful. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Okay, so we see that Brom would prefer to fight him for it. Ichabod is refusing to, so Brom has to resort to something else, right? It says that he's going to play off boorish practical jokes. So this is how he's fighting or battling Ichabod. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night in spite of its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. So we're seeing some of the practical jokes he's playing, right? He's stopping up the chimney so that smoke comes into the schoolhouse, or they're sneaking in at night and flipping the whole thing over. Desks are being turned and papers tossed and inkstands moved everywhere. And then also embarrassing him that when Ichabod goes to teach Katrina how to sing, which remember, Ichabod isn't necessarily the best singer, but he thinks he is, right? That as Ichabod sings, Brom has a dog outside kind of baying and mocking him, which if you've ever seen in movies or shows, right, that's kind of a hint that someone's not a very good singer is when the dog kind of, so he's kind of making or embarrassing Ichabod as Ichabod's trying to teach Katrina to sing. In this way, matters went on for some time. without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. In other words, they just kind of keep doing this and it doesn't really change anything. They're both still sort of interested in Katrina, but they're both seeing that Brom keeps kind of pranking or practical joking Ichabod. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his literary realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, that sceptre of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, popguns, whirligigs, fly cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. So, in terms of his classroom, I think some things are very not familiar to what you would have experienced, but some things maybe are, right? So on the one hand, we see that he's got his switch, which is what he uses to, like the rod that he uses to discipline his children, which of course obviously is problematic, right? However, he also has contraband items, which maybe is familiar, right? Things that you're not supposed to have in the classroom that your teacher confiscates. So he has this whole kind of array of things. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them, with one eye kept upon the master. A kind of buzzing stillness reigned through the schoolroom. So the narrator is telling us that probably he just chastised or disciplined somebody prior to this, and so now they're all very diligently working quietly and trying to stay under the radar. This silence, it was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a man in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat, like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of a halter. He came clattering up to the school with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. And after having delivered his message with an air of importance, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. So he came and delivered to Ichabod an invitation to a quilting frolic, it tells us, or a merrymaking. Okay, so what would we call a quilting frolic or a merrymaking? When we talk about someone being invited to a merrymaking, being invited to a party. Okay, so question 2. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. So the man arrives, he says, Ichabod, you're invited to a party at the Van Tassels, and next thing you know, Ichabod is rushing everyone along. Hurry, 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 finish your math, finish your reading, let's go. And then they all get sent out early because he's excited to go to the party. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet. Toilet in this case means like his dressing room, not like a literal toilet, but like the dressing room where he would go and get ready for the party. Brushing and furbishing up his best and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking-glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman by the name of Hans Van Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. So Ichabod's trying to make a good impression. He's like, I'm going to a party at Katrina's. I really want to show her how great I can be. So he's like, I'm going to borrow the horse of the farmer that I'm staying with right now, and that's going to make me look so fancy. He's can imagine like the version of that nowadays would be like if you're going somewhere and you want to like rent a limo, right, to show up, or maybe borrow a car, your uncle's really nice car to show up, and to have like look special, right? So Ichabod's got this idea. I want to look really exceptional with this horse. But our narrator tells us it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. So he says, I'm going to describe the horse, the steed, the horse, and Ichabod to you. The animal he bestrode was a broken down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused very probably some of his own spirit into the animal. For, old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. So again, we set it up. Ichabod's like hoping to impress Katrina by coming in on a horse. And then we get this description of this horse, right? This is related to question 3. What do we see about this horse? This is not like a very nice looking horse. It's not coming in on a well-groomed, well-tamed, young, healthy horse. He's coming in on a very old, not very well-kept horse. So the equivalent would be like, you think you're gonna like, I'm gonna get a car for this date. It's gonna look great. And then, it's like missing a door, and it's got a flat tire, and the windshield is broken, and there's no side mirrors, and it's rusting everywhere. So he thinks he's going to impress her, but maybe the choice of trying to impress her with this broken down horse is maybe not going to succeed in the way that he wants to. Okay, so question 3 is asking you to just pick one quote to describe this horse. Then we're told that Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. So imagine what the steed looks like. And then we're told that the two of them suit one another. So what do we conclude about Ichabod here, as we're kind of predicting what this is going to look like? If he is suited to a broken down old steed, that tells us that Ichabod maybe himself isn't looking that great. Okay? Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle. If we were in the classroom, you would be seeing me acting this out. I'll try. So he's riding the horse, and his knees are like up here, okay? Which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motions of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of a forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans Van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in the broad daylight. Okay, so again, he's kind of like crouched up and flapping as he rides while holding this whip. So question 4 relates to what we just read there. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frosts into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. Usually, when I'm reading this book, 5th graders, what's being described here really matches what's happening outdoors, right? That there's this change of season. The trees are colorful. Everything's kind of abundant and full. This year has not worked out that way. So it's been a little bit different, more wintry right now than autumnal. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets. In the fullness of their revelry they fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious from the very profusion and variety around them. There was the honest cock robin, the favorite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud, querulous note, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden winged woodpecker with its crimson crest, his broad black gorget, his splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with its red tipped wings and yellow tipped tail, and its little Montero cap of feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb, in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding and bobbing and bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songster of the grove. So we see again that there's this kind of like general, there's animals everywhere. There's like a big, it's very full of animals and plants, and there's lots of, it's harvest time, so there's lots of food. So we see that this is a very robust, full time. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance. Culinary being like cooking and kitchen things cooking. So he's always on the lookout for things related to food. Ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast store of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on, he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered, and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. So what is he thinking about as he's on his way? He's starting to think about food, right? He's imagining eating all this food and having it be prepared for him by Katrina. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which look out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down in the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadow of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky, without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crests of the precipices that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. A sloop, that's a ship, was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the mast. And as the reflection of the sky gleamed along the still water, it seemed as if the vessel was suspended in the air. All right, so night is falling, okay? Getting close to attending the party. So we should have a picture of Ichabod at this point, right? Particularly in comparison with this horse that he's riding and what this tells us about him as he goes. And also what he's thinking about as he's coming to this party. But there should be this feeling of excitement, and there, like, the world is abuzz and everything seems to be kind of going right for Ichabod right now. Okay, so when we pick up, we're gonna go ahead and see what happens at this party. Okay, good luck.